Thank you so much, Rebecca, and to Paula and to the rest of the organising committee. It's a real honour to be invited to give a keynote anywhere, but let alone at a conference that's the first in hopefully a very ambitious series of Ustinov conferences, and at a conference that's on such a fascinating topic. And I was particularly delighted at the invitation to give something more of a warts and all account rather than the kind of grand high theory of interdisciplinarity. Not that the grand high theory has nothing to offer us, but rather that I think hearing in more pragmatic terms about people's experiences is a really excellent starting point, particularly for thinking about future careers and developments of future projects within this very, very broad space. It's almost exactly a year, ironically, in Durham, since there was another big international conference on interdisciplinarity. And that was held by Durham's Institute of Advanced Study on the topic of transfusion and transformation, the creative potential of interdisciplinary knowledge exchange. It was a really interesting 3 days with a whole range of speakers talking about their projects and their research. And what overwhelmingly struck me about the kind of very diverse presentations across those 3 days was the ubiquity of spatial metaphors. There's something very powerful when we're thinking about interdisciplinarity, and it's reflected in the title of this conference, that we seem to grasp for thinking about space and spatial metaphors. So Tom McLeish, the then Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research, for example, was quoting Nicholas Lash in his talk, saying that notwithstanding the accelerated fragments of specialised academic activities, we trample each other's territories whether we want to or not. Which I thought was a really lovely sense of, in a way, we can set out to be very ambitious and interdisciplinary, but we sort of already are in a lot of cases without necessarily really intending it. That idea of trampling leads to, again, kind of one of the other ubiquitous metaphors, the metaphor of the field, that we all work in these fields that may seem wide and open, but as Marilyn Strahan put it in her talk, what kinds of exchanges between participant or practitioners will give emerging form to new fields, particularly where those fields are like forests, less open and expansive and seemingly easy to navigate, more dense and entwined and perhaps slightly darker. There was lots of talk about the flow of knowledge within and between spaces and within and between people. And a key concept to which people kept returning again and again was about territoriality. It was about borders and boundaries, mapping spaces, mapping epistemologies, and about necessarily, in some cases, questions of colonialisation and trampling, questions of back off, these are my spaces, and you're making an incursion that's unwelcome. They were very committed at the IAS to telling us that trespassers would not be prosecuted. I wasn't necessarily convinced, which is why I found the geese are aggressive as a kind of warning. I think we've all probably got experience of working in interdisciplinary collaborations, and one of the things I'd like to start with is the idea that that we don't necessarily need to sign up to it as a necessarily rosy and kind of happy, effectively easy undertaking. There are some aggressive geese out there, and particularly when we incur on their territories, they can be even more so. These spaces that we're navigating are always kind of structured around various hierarchies and around logics of power, whether those are the power that seem to be invested with particularly different disciplines' identities. For example, in the field I work in, Medical Humanities, there's a strong sense that the clinicians hold the reins, that people with medical training and clinical expertise are doing the kind of real work, and that the humanities are some kind of fluffy add-on that perhaps need to justify themselves in more robust terms. That's a really clear and obvious hierarchy. But there are clear power differentials and hierarchies between individuals based on their seniority, on their gender, on all sorts of other factors, which is a point to which I'll return and which doubtless you've already thought before. Lots of talk of comfort zones and getting outside of your comfort zone, which is apparently where the magic happens, with the idea that I think we'd like to think that the funding somehow brought these two things together. There was a sense of going round in circles sometimes of the problematics of interdisciplinary research, where it can take an enormously long time and can seem very difficult to make progress when you're trying to bring so many people together in a certain kind of common undertaking. And those of you who know Ray Land, who has done some extraordinary work around in education around liminal concepts of the liminal and concepts of sort of tribal boundaries and boundedness, gave a fantastic talk really unpacking the metaphor of boundary crossings. So we need kind of notions of passports and quarantines and regulations and thinking about who's an alien in which kind of territory and how we navigate all of that. But one thing that struck me that conference didn't do, and it's something again to which I'll return later in my talk, is really think about interdisciplinarity outside of the academy as well. So it's one thing to talk about how we as academics and researchers navigate within what is a very sanctified and quite prescribed environment of the university, but what happens when we're engaging with partners, with participants, with people who don't share all of the kind of common things that no matter how different a physicist and a classicist, we all have certain kind of structural similarities and certain key drivers that are the same by virtue of being employed by universities or working at universities. So we'll get to the idea of being beyond the ivory tower shortly. But I think all of this talk of space really begs the question about the protagonists who navigate space, about the people who are motivated to inhabit, to use, to traverse, to shape, and ultimately to transform these spaces. So today I want to try and keep both in focus, to try and keep the idea of a common interpersonal configuration between people alive, but also to focus in and to talk a little bit about my experience of what it's like, kind of in a personal and an affective level, to be a navigator of those spaces. I'm going to look at a range of different things in that context, starting with an introduction to our research project, Hearing the Voice, which has been running here at Durham since 2012. I then want to talk about what emerges from the key interpersonal space of our project, which is called Voice Club. I know that sounds really tantalising, so you have to wait to see what that is. And introduce to you Working Knowledge, which is a resource that we've put together and that we hope very much will grow and expand over the coming years, that very much in the spirit of this conference is a series of practical resources that we have put together to try and document how we have worked in an interdisciplinary way, with the idea that some of that learning may be able to be used and picked up and transformed by other projects. And finally, I want to look at some of my own, sounds very grandiose, doesn't it? Reflections on interdisciplinarity, to maybe think about some of the values and virtues and attitudes that at a personal level have made the work easy or difficult at various times. To think about putting academia in perspective, that whole issue of stepping outside the ivory tower, and to end on the cautionary note of the dangers of hammers. Thinking of that idiom that if you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. How can we, if we use interdisciplinarity as our starting point, what comes into the frame and what also might be left out of the frame if we do that. So, part 2 is on Hearing the Voice. Hearing the Voice is a large interdisciplinary research project that's funded by a £1 million grant from the Wellcome Trust. The grant was from 2012 to 2015. It ends in about 2 months, and we have applied for a second tranche of funding to go for another 5 years. So all of these questions about interdisciplinary working are very alive and present for us as we're trying to persuade our funder to let us keep going for a really long amount of time. The project is really fundamentally interested in the phenomenon of hearing a voice when nobody else is speaking. So this might be, in psychiatric parlance, an auditory hallucination. It might be, if you're coming at it from a perspective of kind of medieval theology, it might be a kind of divine revelation, or it might be a vision of God or of some other kind of divine being. There's a whole range of different experiences that are brought together under the kind of fairly loose term of voice hearing, and we're interested in more or less all of them. At the centre of our project then is a very underdescribed, ambiguous, difficult, often highly distressing, but not necessarily so, form of human experience. So how do we get at that? It's not necessarily a kind of standalone empirical object in the world that we can all agree we can define in advance. It's something that is defined through the kinds of various knowledges and forms that we bring to its investigation. In our project, we go back to the late classical period and through all the way into kind of the discussions with contemporary voice hearers. But a key figure for us, for example, is the English mystic from the 14th century, Julian of Norwich, and her revelations of divine love. So one of the things that feeds into our project is her textual account of her divine revelations. But then we go from the medieval to the modern in looking at someone like Virginia Woolf, who herself heard voices, but whose novels open that experience up in a literary way that's often incredibly complex. It's not a direct, straightforward representation of experience, but something going on perhaps at a level of modelling that has been really interesting to work with. We've looked at the testimonies of contemporary voice hearers, both written and in the context of interpersonal exchanges through the International Hearing Voices movement. And we've collaborated very closely to produce not only different forms of research, but also different expressions, artistic expressions with local voice hearers. This is a still from the film we made with Adam, who is a resident of Bishop Auckland and who we worked with to produce a film about his experience, and Eleanor London, who's perhaps at the other end of the spectrum, possibly the world's most famous voice hearer. She gave a TED talk about her experience that's been seen over 3 million times. And is a really close friend of our project, and talking to her about what that experience is of telling her experience has been really fascinating. So that's the kind of range of some of the different ways that we're trying to get at, and I keep saying that word, experience. But then of course there are all sorts of different methods that we can harness in order to try and understand what's going on. Most commonly in psychiatry and psychology, one of the most common ways would be the standardised scales and measures that have been developed clinically, particularly over the last 20-25 years, and we certainly use some of those. We've also used neuroimaging techniques to try and understand, in this case, it's the relationship between inner speech and theory of mind and how those two things might come together. We've used experience sampling techniques, again from psychology, including very innovative things like iPhone apps, which is all terribly exciting for those of us not used to technological wizardry when it comes to research. But we're also then thinking from quite different perspectives about things like how literary texts might offer insights into a kind of modelling of cognitive processes. How do the prose plays and radio plays of Samuel Beckett, for example, give us insight into the kind of internal chatter that goes on in our everyday lives, and that may indeed be closely connected to its aberrant form in voice hearing. We've also designed our own studies and our own kind of scales and measures, and I'll talk a little bit more about that study at another point. But I think if it's a kind of heavy-handed overstatement of all of the very different things that we're doing together within this very large project, the point is that we're interdisciplinary, we think, both out of curiosity and out of a commitment to the kind of inherent respect that we have for each other's disciplines and for the kind of, the good ideas that seem to come from unlikely places, whatever your disciplinary perspective. But I think more than that, we feel we're interdisciplinary out of necessity. That if you want to understand something as opaque, something as complicated as an aspect of human experience, you can't just say psychology will have all the answers. You can't just say, well, we decided that everything from medieval history is irrelevant to that inquiry. There's a real strength to be got when you're thinking about something of that kind in bringing those views together. We aren't immune from spatial thinking in the project. So when we first started conceptualising this, we plotted it on a Venn diagram. So we were interested in experience first and phenomenology and a work package around that, looking then at cognitive neuroscience, hermeneutics, the meaning-making frameworks around voice hearing, therapeutic practice and methodology. And more recently, we decided that it was more useful to think about kind of broad sets of questions rather than disciplinary areas of expertise. So the what is it like question, as I've already just suggested, is something that you can use a whole different range of methods really to get at. And so that's a kind of unpacking of that experience. For those of you, sorry, the reference is a little bit cut off, but more kind of theoretically inclined, my colleague Marco Benini and I published a paper in Wise Cognitive Science that spatially reconfigures a map of the entire project. And this is all sort of slightly more complicated, but it's trying to get at a model of interdisciplinary integration that uses a whole lot of ideas from cognitive science. So the idea loosely here is that you have on the external axes a kind of map of the contributing disciplines in the project, mapped from their reliance on experimental methods through to religion and theology being much less reliant on experimental methods. And the black dots representing the kind of situation of us as individual researchers as disciplinary minds. The questions then that are entering into our research space will move us as we collaborate with certain individuals, as we try to answer them through various exchanges, say for example between cognitive psychology and philosophy of mind. But the crucial part here is that we come together in an interpersonal space that we've described as one that is a we space of enhancing loops. I'm not going to go into the theory because our focus here is on practice, but it's there freely accessible if you would like it later. This is our we space of enhancing loops. It's Voice Club, which I mentioned earlier, and every fortnight for the last 3 years we have met as a project up to between about 15 and 20, 25 people every Friday fortnight in the IAS seminar room to come together to explore a range of different aspects of voice hearing, a range of different disciplinary views. We've had external speakers, we've done a whole different raft of activities, we have watched films, we have made things, there have been biscuits baked, there have been a whole raft of different kind of exploratory techniques that have been used, all thanks largely to this woman with the white hair, who is our creative facilitator. And this is one of the great things I think about our project, is that it has brought in someone whose background is in the arts and education, who is an artist, a theatre designer by trade, who curates this space, who gives a kind of non-academic or comes from outside an academic context to create an environment that opens us up as researchers in ways that I don't think we could possibly do for ourselves. So what happens then in this space of Voice Club? There are, as I've said, all sorts of innovative things that have gone on, and these range from introducing a team to very highly specialised forms of discipline knowledge, through to, at another end, getting an entire team to work together to produce new kinds of interdisciplinary knowledge. So an example of the first one is our postdoctoral fellow Hilary Powell, who is a specialist on 11th and 12th century miracular collections of miracle narratives. Hers are largely focused at Canterbury Cathedral. And she did this extraordinary presentation that took us in a very detailed way through her kind of first thinking about medieval psychology and medieval thought and memory and what was going on in these accounts of visionary experience from that period. But there was one thing of giving a kind of hour-long talk about medieval experience and about the kinds of texts she was working on, but she decided that this wasn't good enough. So in the second hour of Voice Club that day, she gave us all a copy of a board game that she had made, which is an adaptation of Snakes and Ladders, which when you played it, took you through the various encounters that were reported where people had been visited by saints and had had these kind of revelatory experiences, so that we could all get a feeling for the way that these texts actually worked and discover for ourselves in the course of navigating this exquisitely beautiful game, the kinds of different sets of experiences that in that period were being described or that we might think of as being connected to voice hearing now. In a kind of interim sense, we also had a really fascinating meeting where, just before the end of last summer, where we recognise that there's a lot that we do as a team of 18, a lot that happens, across the kind of discussions, but that there's a lot that can't be brought into that space because of time or because it actually is more of a one-on-one event. So we asked all of the researchers in the project to come up with 3 or 4 offers. What's something that you can offer from your disciplinary perspective that somebody else might be interested in? What skill do you have? What insight might you be able to share? So these included things like I could introduce you to how you might approach from the beginning reading a theological text, or one of the psychologists said I could take you to an NHS ethics committee, which was sort of a dubious take up by some people. My favourite actually was here, where our philosopher of mind offered a conceptual hygiene clinic, where you could bring him a paper that you had written and he would go through it like some kind of, tub of bleach or something to make sure that you were, using your terms consistently and not building in any contradictions. But that was a really interesting sense of being able to use this interpersonal space to kind of articulate what it was we might be able to offer other people, and also to then to take up these offers in kind of one-on-one conversations to have those very detailed exchanges. It was a very practical way of trying to foster those kinds of conversations, which otherwise sometimes can get a little bit let through to the keeper. But perhaps one of the most exciting things that we've used this space to do is have a hackathon. I don't know if people are familiar with what a hackathon is. Yes, if we haven't worked in Silicon Valley, chances are we might not have had any. Hackathons come from, and I think I'm right in having read my Wikipedia entry correctly on this, they come from the kind of the computer design and programming world. And the idea is that you bring a whole lot of very talented computer programmers into a room together, close the door, bring in lots of pizzas, sleeping bags, and sort of put them in this hot-housed, intense environment for about 30 hours or however long, and sort of make them create something. And you get these kind of fabulously innovative new apps, and huge amounts of money are made. We sort of took some of these elements, not all of them, and certainly not the great reliance on junk food, but the vision of trying to produce an experimental design hackathon. So trying to think about how we could facilitate a process where we could come together, not just to exchange ideas, but to actually produce an experiment that might, one day actually be conducted. The vision, therefore, or the kind of task at hand was, imagine that you have a fairly unlimited budget to design an fMRI study on some aspect of your research into voice hearing. What are the questions that you still have about this experience that you think that a neuroscientific study might help you get at, might help you answer? And we had a much more relaxed, as you can see, out in the sunshine approach to the initial hackathon, and generated, I think, in that first instance, something like 20 different possibilities. Some of those possibilities were really wild and could never be things you could do in a scanner, but they were an important first step. And what we did in the second iteration of the hackathon was to focus in very specifically on the personification of voices. So the idea that you're hearing a voice that somehow starts to acquire much more than just a series of kind of acoustic properties or semantic properties. It starts to feel as though it's a person. How does that happen? How is it that with the people who hear voices are convinced that there are people that they're hearing, not just voices or not just sounds that they're hearing? And how might we investigate that in relationship to our own inner speech? So we got everybody back together, and we were much clearer in the second iteration about the kind of the parameters of experimental design. So, for example, as you'll know if you've looked at all at fMRI, one of the absolute things you have to do is lie still and not move your head, otherwise none of the scans work. So there was one person who wanted something that was very expressive and out there in the world, and that clearly couldn't happen. So we looked at what experimental situations might be like, which was for many of us a huge learning curve, and then developed in some quite concrete ways some ideas that I'm delighted to report now are finally actually being kind of operationalised. It was a very intensive, very labour-intensive process on the day and afterwards, but it resulted ultimately in ideas that would not have been possible had those kind of very hothouse facilitated exchanges been able to happen. And the studies that are being run, or the study that's being run, is looking at the ways reading and our kind of processing of literary characters and the voice of literary characters relates potentially to different forms of inner speech, which, if it works, which I'm sure it will generate some interesting results even if it doesn't work technically, is a really exciting initiative. This whole process is documented in a project short as part of our Working Knowledge initiative. So this is what I'd really like to commend to you. It's a website that we built and launched at the Wellcome Trust in February this year. And essentially, under 3 headings, engaging others, working together in people and roles, it sets out very pragmatic elements of interdisciplinary research and how-to. WorkingKnowledgePS.com is the URL. And we're, as I said, very keen to welcome other contributions. So if you have been working in a particularly interesting project, in a particularly interesting collaboration, or if you want to document based on your papers today or what you hear today in the aspects of those experiences, we'd really, really welcome your contributions. This is what you can download for the site. They're these short, pithy kind of introductions to our take on things like collaborations between academics and clinicians, engaging voice hearers, which I'll talk a little bit about later, and the interdisciplinary dialogue is a dialogue, kind of stage dialogue, between one of our psychology postdocs and one of the philosophy postdocs about what they've learned and the challenges that they've faced in working together across those boundaries. So it might, as I say, be of interest to you, and I hope that you'll have some time to check it out. So, if that's broadly kind of some thoughts on space, some thoughts on the project and what's emerged for us in kind of some detailed ways about the different ways that we've been working and the different kinds of approaches that we've developed to answering some of the questions that arise with voice hearing. I want to end in the final part of my talk just by talking a little bit, I hope not indulgently, but personally about some of the things that I've found in navigating all of these spaces. To do that, I need to tell you a little bit about my background, which is that I guess my entire university life was effectively in a highly interdisciplinary arts faculty at the University of Melbourne, where I did a degree in literary and cultural studies. The cultural studies part included courses from philosophy, social theory, cinema studies, a whole range of different things, and the literary studies was about as cultural studies as literary studies can possibly get, so it feels like quite a kind of quite an interdisciplinary starting place in terms of an educational background. When I was working at the University of Melbourne, I worked on schizophrenia, and my work was published in the International Perspectives in Philosophy and Psychiatry series as a book which looked at the way schizophrenia had been written about in clinical theory, psychiatry and psychoanalysis, and cultural theory. It was a highly conceptual, theoretical PhD, then book that was all about the world of texts. That's what I'd been trained in, that's what I was interested in doing, that's what I was an analyst of. And so I did this work almost entirely by myself through no particular collaborations, and I'm almost ashamed, in fact no, I am ashamed to say, that at no point did I ever discuss it in any kind of robust way, either with anybody who'd received a diagnosis of schizophrenia or with anyone who worked clinically. It just somehow wasn't it wasn't on the agenda, it wasn't perceived by my advisors and my colleagues as relevant, it was detached from the work that I was doing. After that experience, I went on to work in the School of Graduate Research, and I ended up in a role that led me to design the first interdisciplinary coursework program for doctoral students that Australia had run, the Advanced Graduate Certificate in Advanced Learning and Leadership. And that was something completely outside of my disciplinary field, but a really fascinating chance to kind of think about if you were going to run a graduate certificate for PhD students that would try and complement their discipline studies and try and build in kind of new skills and new perspectives, what might that look and feel like? And that was the answer that we came up with, and that's still going. But then I came to Durham in 2010 as a lecturer in Medical Humanities, and my whole kind of orientation from a really exclusively technical and textual and theoretical world into a world much more accommodating of lived experience kind of really began. And that was work in the Centre for Medical Humanities. So some of my early work in that context was looking at, still in a textual frame, looking at narrative and looking at people's representations of their experiences of health and illness and how narrative as a concept within the field of medical humanities had been developed. You know, still a kind of safely textual literary mode. But then becoming co-director of the Hearing the Voice project expanded that whole world yet again. And all of a sudden it was a chance for me to move really in a whole lot of ways into completely new ways of working that became experimental, became empirical, didn't lose sight of the conceptual and theoretical, but really widened the kind of range of methodologies to which I was exposed and which I got involved. And the most recent publication of which I'm a co-author is an empirical study. It's a mixed method study of the experience of voice hearing that's just come out in the Lancet Psychiatry. So it's a kind of broadly similar territory, but it's a completely different kind of piece of research to have undertaken with potentially very different consequences. So within all of that, and I kept coming back to this, I think, really fantastic quote, there remains a persistent idea that transdisciplinary scholars should be masters of their own domain, that they must enter collaboration knowing who they are, what they have to offer, and what they want to achieve. And I think this is a tacit assumption of so much of particularly the positive rhetoric around interdisciplinarity, that we know that we are a medieval historian, that this is what we want to get out of the collaboration, and that this is what we can offer, and it's all kind of incredibly well-defined and purposeful and agreed on by everybody. And I really strongly recommend this article to you by my colleague Des Fitzgerald and his colleagues, which is all about the effective dynamics of interdisciplinary research and how things do go very wrong. Of course, this emphasis on mastery, this emphasis on purposeful knowing of what it is one has to offer and wants to achieve, leads, at least in my experience, directly to the imposter syndrome and to a sense that it can be very difficult, particularly at an early career stage, to feel as though you have anything resembling mastery, that you have a clear and resounding purpose about what it is you want to achieve. So I think one of the things that perhaps it might be interesting to discuss over the course of the day is how we cope with some of those kind of uncertainties, which in my view are very legitimate and actually quite productive and not things we should necessarily wish away under the banner of rank mastery. I think it's far from being mastery, a sense of kind of, and this is where performance was a word that crept into the title of my talk, a sense that one is constantly being called upon in an interdisciplinary context to assert, to perform, to somehow display one's credentials, that you can't take anything for granted, you have to kind of constantly keep bringing these things to the fore. And in my experience, that means that some people have become, when you're in these large collaborative projects, become almost hyper-disciplined. They become almost sort of so over-invested or invested in being the psychologist and, being very, very clear that that's the kind of disciplinary space that they occupy. And my experience has been the complete opposite in a way, that I found it very much more a case of unmooring, or a case of having to think that my kind of academic identity and who I am as a scholar gets unmade a whole lot. So if you Google that, you will very quickly get to this wonderful, you must be unlearning, or perhaps a little less sort of Yoda-like. The idea that when you're unlearning, you're also then relearning. That in fact, one of the challenges is letting go of that sense of kind of a hyper-disciplined mode and thinking that one may not actually know and may have to be embracing of being a novice all over again. Within the context then of these sort of dramas and dynamics of learning and unlearning and knowledge and unknowledge, I think you get into some senses of what are the kinds of personal qualities and what are the kinds of attitudes that really foster good collaboration, or that seem to be prerequisites for people actually being able to work together in effective ways. And I'm sure everyone has kind of their own list, and I don't want to sound too Girl Scout about this, like we all have to have these list of virtues as though they sort of drop out of the sky, or they're kind of these unique personality traits. But certainly if you don't have curiosity about the topic at hand or about other people's views on that topic, why you're engaging in a collaboration seems to me to be a sort of moot point. There is a kind of difficulty with remaining open to other ideas. It can be, as I sort of suggested before, incredibly slow and difficult and really frustrating, but I think it's really crucial. We were talking last night about humility, about the importance of kind of letting go to an extent of one's own authority, and I've learned a huge amount from the senior professors that we work with, who are really happy to work with PhD students from other disciplines in a sense that says, I don't know anything about the brain and about neuroanatomy, and can you please tell me what the amygdala does? Which is not something that everyone is necessarily born into this world eager to do. Ambivalence, or a kind of tolerance for ambiguity, an appetite for risk, which proves to be another really hard thing to Google, and almost all of the pictures are about people jumping over cliffs, so I just decided to go with it. No, you've got to be able to jump over the cliff and hope that the crevasse is not so deep. So this whole mix of dynamics, this whole mix of things is one thing within the relatively safe space of the academy. And that space can feel quite brutal at times, it can feel quite charged. for some of us it's 90% of kind of the limits of our world on occasion. But I think the thing that I found the most challenging about the work that we've done on Hearing the Voice is about exiting that space and entering into other spaces. And that's working with people who hear voices. Not everyone who hears voices is troubled by it, or has an experience of mental ill health, or is distressed, or has experienced trauma, but a large number of people have had incredibly traumatic experiences, have suffered from huge forms of distress, have been hospitalised, have been diagnosed, have been heavily medicated, and may be what researchers like to broadly call members of vulnerable groups. So in terms of how we as a project can learn from, respect, engage with people who have very different modes of engagement potentially from well, in my case from me, has been just a really fascinating learning curve and often presented some real challenges. This is at the level of kind of interpersonal communication. We're thinking about how we need to be sensitive to the fact that people might be hearing voices at the time that we're actually speaking to them, and what kind of challenges that might pose towards kind of clarity of the communication, through to the just simple acknowledgement that when I'm participating in anything that we do, it's as somebody with a full-time job who's relatively kind of well supported by my colleagues and stable and free to determine my own future to a really large extent. And we might be working with people who have just come out of hospital, or who are on benefits, who may have a much more precarious kind of relationship to being within the university space that we're in. So I went last year to the World Hearing Voices Congress in Thessaloniki in Greece. And this was about 300 people, the majority of whom were voice hearers or families or carers of people who hear voices and allies of people who hear voices. And this is an incredibly powerful people's movement, strong kind of mental health advocacy, but possibly the most humbling experience I've ever had of being on a panel and presenting this research that we'd done that ended up being published in the Lancet Psychiatry about the experience of voice hearing. But also on that panel was somebody talking about their experiences of working with people who had attempted suicide, and their experience of hearing voices and working with people in prison who also heard voices. And it was, for me, a whole huge set of questions about what it is to be producing research and scholarship and academic knowledge in the context of people whose knowledge comes from practice, from life, from the kind of full range and breadth of lived experience. And it was something that that I haven't fully reconciled, and that I think it's important for researchers to do. It's not as though research is somehow irrelevant or tangential to the world of voice hearers. But it was something that I think certainly made me feel that as much as we've harped on about interdisciplinary differences within the project, actually I had much, much more in common with even some of the more hardcore neuroscientists than I did with people who were talking from a completely different epistemological place, sometimes with a very different ethic and with completely different goals of wanting to emancipate voice hearers, of wanting to change the world, of wanting to reform mental health services, and not being interested in peer-reviewed publications at all, which is completely fine. So the very final point that I want to end on then is the point about the dangers of hammers. So it's thinking about the kind of scholarship that we produce and the kind of impact that we have, the kind of difference that potentially we make, is of course a question of disciplines. It's a question of knowledge, what we know, what we do with that knowledge, the methods that we use to produce that knowledge, the kind of culture of knowledge production that we work in, our disciplinary expertise. All of these things are really important. But disciplines aren't the whole picture either. And so while this is a whole day of thinking about interdisciplinarity, I kind of encourage us to think about what are the other factors that are in play or in the room or that are coming into kind of view when we're thinking about the ways that we work together. So those might be personal, structural, institutional. They could be about gender. They could be about people's experience of working collaboratively from other kind of areas. They could be about different skills. I think interdisciplinarity within the context of the academy is a really fascinating starting point for discussions about research collaboration more broadly. And it's a very productive place to kind of begin to think about what it is we do, why, how it works, and how we can do it better. But I would say that kind of keeping in focus that sense of entanglement and what's in the mix, what's in the room, and how we can kind of better understand that is a really crucial part of the process too. So thank you.